Filthy little one, stop with the commentary and objections because you reek like a gypsy. You crows should be gassed because if you were shot, we would run the risk that one of you might get away. The cancer of society, that's what you all are. Jeguasamika, filthy little one, a stereotype about my ethnicity. This is how a young woman addressed me on a Facebook post on my own Facebook timeline. You can never understand truly what it is like to be called a racial slur until one is addressed to you directly. Drenched in syrupy, rotten hate, as bitter as it is hard to swallow. I didn't know what it would feel like either until it happened to me. Most recently, by this young woman from Yash, whose toothy smile profile picture wouldn't have given away her predilection for ethnic cleansing. I chose to begin with this violent example of racism that was directed towards me because it exemplifies what I, on an individual level, have had to heal from, and at the same time acts as a mirror on society, demonstrating what we as a whole still need to heal from. So I want to ask two sets of questions. What does it mean to heal on a personal level and overcome the power of racism and the shame and injury that comes with it? And then zooming out, also ask, what does it mean to heal on a societal level? To recognize and repent so that we can begin to imagine a future in which no one has to feel the effects of racism. Writer and poet Joseph Brodsky wrote in a late essay that, quote, "The real history of consciousness starts with one's first lie." A woman at the town library asked him to state his ethnicity, and despite knowing full well that he was of Jewish descent, he responded, quote, "I don't know," to the registrar. His first lie was about his ethnic identity, and so was mine. I, like Brodsky, knew from an early age that my ethnicity was something it was better to hide. I still recall the feeling of blood rushing to my cheeks, my face hot when my first grade desk mate asked me why I don't look like her other Romanian friends. I had short hair, I wore dark colors, I had pristine behavior. I learned to live as a reaction to a stereotype, everything inverted. My parents immigrated to America in 1985 to escape communist Romania. For as long as I can remember, a scratchy vinyl recording of a virtuosic violinist playing flitter-flighting up and down the fingerboard was presented to me as the epitome of the musical contributions of a maligned racist subgroup called the Lăutari. My grandfather was a Lăutar. He was a Roma violinist. So when I decided to combat my first lie with an intimate truth, I decided to make a film that explored my Roma identity through interviews with my parents and through a close portrait of Nicu Ciotoi, a once well-known Roma violinist. And he became sort of an understudy for my own grandfather in my story.
Mama mea a fost o femeie frumoasă. A fost cu părul șaten roșcat și albă la față ca laptele și ochii căprui verzui. Și când a fost tata plecat în armată, mama a avut un post de bufetieră chiar în gura oborului, din București. Și când a venit tata din armată, tata era un foarte fain violonist. Avea un arcuș foarte bun. Și i-a spus asta și Ionel Budișteanu și toți muzicanții care l-au auzit, including Tudor Pană cu care a cântat la restaurant. Și mama i-a spus lui tata, pentru că dacă mama era albă și atenă, cum ți-am spus și asta, tata era negru ca Anwar Sadat. Și mama a zis că nu vrea să zică toți opincarii de români, mă, țigane, vină și cântăm și mie. Că murea mama dacă zicea așa. Înțelegi? Și a spus lui tata, te duci la frizerie, că măta știu ce faci. Te-a băgat în lume. El, tata, se ținea de hărți. Desena hărți, avea drum de ducă. Probabil că de la tata am moștenit drumul ăsta de ducă. Dar am ajuns în America. Și cum să-ți explic eu, tata a fost chemat de ansamblu Igena, că știa toți că e bun violonist, și tata nu s-a mai dus. Și totdeauna când a făcut meseria asta de frizer, de vreo 30 de ani a făcut meseria, a zis că își bagă briciul pe aici și și-l scoate pe aici. Nu i-a plăcut meseria de frizer, dar a înțeles-o pe mama că exista persecuție de țigani de astea și s-a dus la frizerie.
Noi am fost câțiva pe degete care am promovat muzica lăutărească din tradiție, din familii, respectiv de lăutari. Noi am fost la școli de muzică, noi am învățat acasă la părinți, am fost întotdeauna vrednici pentru meseria noastră. Ne-a plăcut meseria asta. Noi, chiar dacă eram mai în etate sau asta, totuși oamenii ne respectau și ne doreau, eram plăcuți. Acum s-a mai schimbat tot. Da.
Immigration is a rupture. No matter if it's by choice or forced, it always represents a break, a leaving behind, and that pain gets passed down to further generations. In 2013, I began the delicate work of suturing that wound of separation. The film's title, Light Upon, comes from the quite astounding good fortune I had to meet Nicu on the streets of Bucharest, a deus ex machina moment in my life. I felt that I had found my grandfather reincarnate, a portal into the lives and memories of my parents' Romania, memories for which I carried an inexplicable surrogate nostalgia. Telling Nicu's story felt like telling my grandfather's. Even today, listening to him play continues to heal that pain of separation, of loss, of social exclusion and shame that came with my parents leaving, reconnecting me to a culture that was stripped from me. He is the thread which I sew back together the past and the present. I say stripped quite intentionally. In light of the story my father tells in this clip about my grandmother who sought to protect her family from humiliation by forbidding her husband from performing in public. I've been telling this story about a shame that I couldn't name for years before I realized that there's an invisible character in this story, and its name is racism. It lives in our society and permeates us all as victims and perpetrators. My story is a story of racism's profound influence on one family's decision to abruptly truncate generational transmission of one's own culture. It was racism that cut my grandfather off from his creative endeavor. The passing down of this precious cultural inheritance ended, and the ripples of this racism were felt generationally. Neither my father nor his brothers learned to play, and this same racism denied me access to a world that I now struggle and flail, but mostly fail to rediscover and recreate. I learned then that racism can rob us of so many things. In the case of forced assimilation or a hostile, discriminatory society, the result is often a loss of cultural heritage, like language or music, as was the case in my own family, and many families who failed to pass down their culture because of persecution. Racism can also mean that institutions fail to recognize and preserve a marginal culture because national heritage often means something homogeneous, which expels the other as foreign. These systems of racism can become much more extreme. In the case of genocide, racism costs human lives. Which brings me to the second part of my story. It's August 2nd, 2014. I'm 24 years old. The sign above my head reads Arbacht macht frei. I am at the 70th anniversary commemoration of the liquidation of the Zigeunerlager at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Despite the fact that I myself am Roma, it wasn't until early adulthood that I learned of the genocide committed against Roma people during the Second World War. Here again, I experienced a complete rupture between myself and my ethnic heritage. I was shocked and appalled. Appalled that I was completely ignorant of a historical incident that could have targeted and exterminated my own family. Appalled that not just I as a Roma person, but I as a citizen of this planet was completely ignorant of a historical incident as grave as the systematic murder of Roma and Sinti, a long people of Jewish and Slavic origin, and others murdered on the basis of sexual orientation or religious and political beliefs. I thought about the busload of other Roma with whom I'd spent 24 hours traveling to this commemoration, and how they also didn't know. And it began to feel like an injustice that we collectively didn't know, and that we extends beyond my fellow Roma on that bus. It extends beyond my American classmates who also don't know about the Roma experience of the Holocaust. The we extends beyond the national borders of Romania. It was then that I became aware of the staggering silence and forgetting surrounding Roma persecution during the Holocaust and slavery on an international level. Imagine being African American and learning about slavery at the age of 24. Or being Jewish and learning about the Holocaust only after graduating from college. This would never happen. It could not happen. But this does happen often when it comes to the history of Roma. There is something unique about Roma trauma, the 500 years of enslavement on Romanian territory, genocide during the Holocaust, and ongoing discrimination, and the way it has been muted and distorted for centuries. So I began asking, what are the conditions that made it possible for me to have made it to 24 years old, completely blind to the suffering of my own people? In searching for an answer, I came across this brilliant quote from Bell Hooks that sheds light on this process of historical unknowing. She writes, "One must face a palimpsest of written histories that erase and deny, that reinvent the past to make the present vision of racial harmony and pluralism more plausible. To bear the burden of memory, one must willingly journey to places long uninhabited, searching the debris of history for traces of the unforgettable, all knowledge of which has been suppressed." She goes on to quote Itabari Ngiri, who laments that nobody really knows us. So institutionalized is the ignorance of our history, our culture, our everyday existence that often we don't even know ourselves. So this then begs the question of where do we look for suppressed knowledges? Foucault tells us that the counter-history will speak from the side that is in darkness, from within the shadows, from those who find themselves in darkness and in silence. Roma history has indeed been silenced, but Roma themselves have not been silent. And in my work, I search for the counter-histories of Roma in oral traditions. These musical oral testimonies have the power to catalyze a remembering of misremembered, passed over, or unwritten stories. Before I play for you an example from this genre of music, I'd like to underline a distinction between archive and repertoire, between the archive, as Diana Taylor states, of supposedly enduring materials, i.e. texts or documents, building, or even bones, and the so-called ephemeral repertoire of embodied practice and knowledge. And here we're talking about spoken language or dance, even sports, rituals, and music. This distinction highlights the issue of politics of memory. Whose stories, memories, struggles, and cultural artifacts are visible and whose are not? What do we put away for safekeeping in temperature-controlled buildings with ornate Greek columns outside? And what has been left to rot in the putrid air of society that chooses to forget? We gain very different kinds of knowledge from primary sources from the archive versus affective, embodied, and personal accounts that we get from things like musical testimony. Very often, the voices of Roma are completely absent from the archive. For example, this excerpt from on the top from Gheorghe Făcuaru demonstrates the biopolitical war on Roma. He was a Romanian eugenicist who wrote of ridding Romania of its Roma population within a generation via internment and sterilization. The other archival document asks if, quote, gypsy musicians and comb makers fall into category 2 of gypsy nomads and non-nomads, i.e. it's asking whether or not they were deportable, whether they could be forcibly removed from their homes and sent to a wasteland where they endured forced labor, starvation, and sexual assault. Now, what kind of knowledge do we gain from listening to affective performance from a Roma survivor? So this clip is from a film by Michel Kelso, a historian and filmmaker.
Yani transmisen gızdelen kokol kozu küçüldelen Tamarine bağlale tamulale romasya mamu Najevla bezak baro timiran ve çavterno Opo malole bugosko cimitiri romanu Mamasa nu-i plângeam acum. Asta a fost un cântic scos de țigan cu jale care a fost.
As important as the song itself is the rupture in performance, in which the singer stops abruptly to explain, quote, "We would cry there. That was a song written by Roma about the sorrow that we experience there," end quote. Music, performance, but also testimony conveys emotion in the way a piece of paper never can. It tells a human story. I cannot begin to describe the feeling I had the first time I sat across from a Holocaust survivor, imagining that their physical being was witness to and victim to atrocious violence I had only read about. It was one of the most powerful moments of my life that I wish everyone had such an opportunity. But testimony is as close as many folks will get as survivors are passing away. A recent survey conducted on Holocaust Remembrance Day found that many adults lack basic knowledge of what happened during the Holocaust. As the number of survivors continues to dwindle, this study concluded that collective memory of the Holocaust is beginning to fade. The genocide of Roma and Sinti people by the Nazis and their allies is a lesser known and even more precarious part of this history. Which is why testimony is important. It can mend lacunae in the historiography. And by conjuring empathy, specificity, and humanity, it taps into a powerful mechanism for reigniting memory and collective memory, breaking the culture of silence, which is so vital to the project of making sure history doesn't repeat itself. I am not suggesting that Roma must constantly prove to the rest of humanity that they too belong among the ranks of the human species by conjuring empathy. Rather, what I'm suggesting is that in telling counterhistories of the Roma through the repertoire, since the archive is an exclusionary place, we access Roma subjectivity that has been heretofore silenced in centuries of persecution, distortion, and exoticized misrepresentations. Returning to Hooks's words, she hones in on one very important aspect surrounding ignorance, or the culture of silence, and that is the institutionalization of forgetting. The genocide enacted towards Roma and the enslavement of Roma are a collective historical trauma. The discourses surrounding Roma historical trauma is decades behind other work relating to marginalized groups. Although still contentious, in the US, some at least draw a through line between centuries of slavery, Jim Crow laws, lynching, ongoing systemic and structural racism, oppression, mass incarceration, and the way these historical realities affect many generations of African Americans. This is completely lacking when it comes to Roma, meaning that Roma have an original wound, slavery and genocide, that has been re-traumatized for decades because of the lack of awareness of the historical suffering. The way in which society has failed to bear witness to these historical traumas impedes both an acknowledgement of the enduring effects of trauma on Roma lives, and secondly, impedes healing from the original wound. Healing requires recognition so that we might arrive at reconciliation. We as a society need to understand that community means that everything I do will affect you, and everything you do will affect me, and that culture is about what each of us is carrying forward. So we have to ask ourselves and each other, what are you carrying forward? Roma carry forth memory and pain and survival strategies to get through that pain. But everything you do will affect me. That's how community works. So Roma cannot be the only ones keeping memory alive. What each of us are carrying forward really matters. In Cimitir Romano, the song we listened to, the singer is asking us to hear the winds blowing for the dead Roma. He's asking for recognition. This is how individual memory becomes collective memory. And collective memory is vital to the process of healing. From the Rwandan genocide to the Armenian genocide, groups that have been targeted and murdered on the base of race and ethnicity all seek one thing in their pathway to healing, and that is recognition. And it is no different in the case of Roma survivors and the Roma community more broadly. In order for these wounds to heal, they need to be tended to, not ignored, brushed aside, or hastily covered up by governments, institutions, or people whose interests aren't served by this recognition of history. Preservation of memory is important for the struggle for recognition, acknowledgement, and reconciliation. But it's impossible to heal from trauma without reciprocity, without someone to listen, without someone to care. Reconciliations can look like reparations, apologies, commemorations, memorials. And in enacting these things, we begin to forge civic trust, as well as individual and collective healing after trauma. But in enumerating this list, it strikes me how far we still have to go before we can heal together. Though we have a Holocaust museum in Bucharest, only now has there been a governmental initiative to establish a Holocaust museum. And in many other ways, we fail as a society to treat survivors with the respect they deserve. There are Roma survivors who don't receive reparations to which they're entitled to by law for the 2 years they were deported to Transnistria. In January of this year, Roma were left out of a ceremony decorating Holocaust survivors. And it goes without saying that Holocaust education, not to mention Roma Holocaust education, is virtually non-existent in Romania. And things are not much different beyond these national borders. Healing from the lack of representation, to put it lightly, or violent exclusions more aptly, involves a dual process of healing, of Roma reconnecting to our heritage, but more importantly, everyone else learning about a history that should never be cordoned off, marginalized, or segmented as Roma history, because it's our history, it's our communal history as a nation and as a human race. Only then do we begin to heal. If we recognize that the original injury was to define Roma almost upon their arrival to Europe 12 centuries ago as not belonging to the Romanian nation, using ethnocentrism and xenophobic logics to other and dehumanize the Roma, enslave and murder them, then we must also recognize that in order to undo this, we must do more than simply revise textbooks and erect monuments. It's not only about preservation of memory, but it's also about insurrecting our current national narratives with Romani memory. This would in turn catalyze a radical redefinition of our national historical narratives. We cannot continue to relegate historical atrocities only to the realm of the past tense. The rise of populism in Europe goes hand in hand with an attack on its most vulnerable populations, most notably in Salvini's reign of terror against Roma in Italy, in Ukraine, with resurgent neo-Nazi violence towards Roma, or the decades of evictions of Roma in France and the ultra-right Hungarian Jobbik party's near-constant anti-Roma propaganda. Roma are one of Europe's most vulnerable communities, and the unparalleled way in which Roma trauma has been muted, distorted, and erased has undoubtedly contributed to this vulnerability. Given current events in Europe with regard to rising anti-Roma sentiment, violence, and xenophobia, it's easy to understand what brought Chaya Stoica to say that Auschwitz is only sleeping. We live in terrifying fascist times in which white supremacy is normalized by world leaders, a world of mass shootings, police violence, pogroms, in which Roma lives, along with other stigmatized groups across the globe, are in peril. This is why these issues are so urgent, so pressing, and why the stories we tell about Roma desperately need to change. As Toni Morrison said, quote, "Narrative is radical, creating us at the very moment it is being created," end quote. Narratives have the power to constitute who we are. Telling and listening to a story has the power to heal. They have the power to define who we are as a society. But the current stories we tell about Roma simultaneously feed into and are born of an ideology of white supremacy. They are false caricatures that hyper-focus on negative stereotypes. As critical race theorist Jose Medina describes, this fetishization of alterity alienates us from each other, making it difficult to sympathize or empathize and see the other in all their beautiful specificity. Stereotypes are, as Bell Hooks says, like fictions, created to serve as substitutions, standing in for what is real. They are fantasy. They are a projection onto the other that abounds when there is a distance, a pretense that one employs when the steps that would make real knowing possible cannot be taken, are not allowed. So let's make real knowing possible. How do we heal as a society from this widespread plague called racism? Maybe the change begins with things as small as speaking up when somebody says, "I was gypped," or "Hai să nu ne țigănim," but also by intimating the distance that is too often filled in with fiction, replacing it with specificity, humanity, voice, nuance, subtlety, as an antidote to the stereotypes that dominate discourse around Roma. Our society has historically stripped Roma of their subjectivity, and by telling stories, we might have a chance to re-enliven them. The challenges faced by Roma to overcome deeply ingrained mechanisms of structural racism are too many to list. Segregation, access to healthcare, jobs, housing, stereotypical representations in the media, hate speech, etc. So I struggled with what to say to a room full of talented storytellers. It felt like a singular opportunity to make an impact about the kinds of stories we're telling about Roma as a society. I didn't want this to be another tokenistic Roma intervention that begins with a story of ethnic stigmatization and ends on a heartwarming note of interracial harmony. We are so far from achieving that, and I cannot pretend to have the answer to how to set us on that path. So in my struggle, I did what ethnographers do, and I phoned a friend, rather 15 friends. 15 Roma women from my community, both in the US and in Romania. And I asked them, if you had the chance to talk to a room of non-Roma, what would you say? And I'd like to leave you with two of the insights that they shared with me. Quote, tell them they have so many privileges. We don't begin the game with the same chances as you. We retain in our DNA trauma that we have internalized, and we pass on with each new generation, and the entire system on which our society is built does nothing but perpetuate that trauma. Or an 18-year-old woman who says, quote, life is sometimes unfair, and very easily our dreams are shattered due to the people around us judging us harshly. When I started school, our professor made a derogatory comment about Roma. Moments like this cut away at your strength, but it's important not to let yourself fall and believe in yourself and show them that you can do more. End quote. Before healing comes hurt, a racial slur, a minor trauma, a major trauma like genocide. An injury needs attention. Time does not heal all wounds. To eschew affection, Roma need to be able to tell their story and incite a collective exorcism of centuries of accumulative trauma, not limited just to the pain of slavery and genocide, but also everyday hurt. It hurts me when I imagine someone seeing my father's dark skin and judging him. It hurts me hearing stories of my mom being called gypsy in her home of 30 plus years of America. As I'm sure it hurt my father hearing his dad being called Tsigan. We carry the burden of the injurious words others direct to the ones we love. I know it hurts my friends when I'm called dirty little gypsy, or when someone uses the word Tsigan pejoratively at work. This web of hurt is called empathy, and it's the only hope we have as a society. As it grows in ever-widening circles, perhaps then we can gradually begin to heal. Thank you.